Okay, hi YouTube. I want to do a different kind of vlog today. I'm going to be doing an informative blog about the history and the lifespan of one of my favorite subgenres, the 90s slacker era films. I'll just start with kind of a brief description of what I'm talking about. Now, in the 90s, during the same time as the alternative rock movement, anywhere between 1991 to 1997, 99, sort of, within this period of time, there was this popularity in the comedies and dramas that sort of focused on the slacker generation, or the Generation X. That was young during that period. Now they're all in their 30s and early 40s, but at the time they were in their 20s, and they were being marketed to in a strange way that hasn't really happened since or before then. There was a lot of cool little character movies that came out during that period of time, sort of documenting the popularity of this Generation X aesthetic that was in the air at the time, the whole Lollapalooza sort of generation. So, obviously, the themes of alienation, boredom, dissatisfaction, a sort of clever wit or irony, but not necessarily full-on comedy, and not necessarily full-on drama either. Sort of this weird blurring between the two. Sometimes, genre-wise, the films would go more one way than the other, but it's always sort of in the middle. The everyday working class, meaning, the people who make minimum wage, the lower middle class, was sort of the celebrated youth generation that was sort of always in these movies. Young adults, people who are in their 20s, usually not much younger, maybe 16 to 18, but usually in the 20s, 20 to 30 years old, very rarely much older than that, as you would be getting into kind of a different mindset. The passage of time, specifically the passage of night and day, or day to night, was very common in these movies, where the film would begin during 7 a.m. or something like that, and it would end at like 7 a.m. the next morning, or midnight, or 2 a.m. or something like that. The structure was always, usually, not always, but usually built around the time span of a day, and there was a lot of scenes that have to deal with how these sort of bored underclass, or lower class, I should say, not underclass, sort of college age people, how do they spend their day? Environmental characters, the city in which they live in, the state in which they live in, and this is primarily American, especially the city in which they lived, certain locations like convenience stores, malls, gas stations, community centers, things like this, the concerts, places that normal people go every day, sort of become an extra character in the movie. And character-based plots, and I kind of talked about this a little bit when I was talking about Danny Boyle and his stuff in England. His stuff is more situational, meaning, Trainspotting is about drug dealing and dealing with social issues and things like that in a very direct sort of way. Don't do drugs. The drugs will lead to this. Or in the case of Shallow Grave, it's a very situational plot that has to do with a group of people who find money and those are all situational plots. So if it's something, sort of contrived, like there's a bomb or there's a money and there's a girl who's screwing somebody over, these kinds of things, that's all very genre sort of plot devices. These movies that I'm talking about are more character driven. Now each character within a movie may have their own plot or subplot that's going on, a small character arc, but usually there's multiple ones. So it's less about following a story and more about following the characters. I think the earliest obvious antecedent to the slacker era generation films of the 90s would be the early independent movement of the 80s. Now, independent film was very different then than it is now. Back then, there was no such thing as like these focus features and Warner Independent, these kinds of distribution companies that allowed these movies to be seen on a wide scale. And video was still a relatively new creation, so it was hard to get distribution that way either. But there were people making independent films, a lot of people actually, and these people kind of later went on to do bigger and better things in the 90s, and even now making high-budget films. But I'd say some of the early filmmakers who were kind of breaking narrative structure and doing more character-based things and doing things that were the environment and passage of time and these kinds of tropes that I was talking about would be Spike Lee with some of his New York films in the 80s, and Jim Jarmusch during around the same time, later Gus Van Sant, and Steven Soderbergh with Sex, Lies, and Videotape specifically as a kind of a character-based movie, dialogue-based movie about a certain kind of person during the time that it was made. Now, these movies are not necessarily, or these directors even, not necessarily really contributed to the exact type of film that I'm talking about, but their aesthetic and what they brought to the table showed that there was a different way that you could make movies, and you could make movies based upon character, based upon sort of foibles and dialogue and these kinds of things, and this kind of set the stage for the popular films that would come out in the 90s. Off-Broadway plays were becoming very popular during the 80s as well, to the mid to late 80s, or off-Broadway, that kind of dealt with a lot of these same issues. Of course, it's sort of extremely popular now, and it's sort of a cliche to even mention, but Rent, even though that was a musical and it's kind of over the top in its own way, it dealt with real people, and it has this whole ensemble kind of thing, and this very Generation X aesthetic that a lot of these films kind of, I wouldn't say were necessarily influenced by, but maybe subconsciously were. But even at this time, there were a lot of realist kind of plays that were being made, sort of in the Arthur Miller sort of vein, but dealing with a younger generation, dealing with this Generation X that didn't really have a voice in the 80s in the popular culture. And these off-Broadway productions, and I have to believe had some sort of cinematic effect later on in the 90s. Especially with directors working from New York and LA. I think stand-up comedy kind of had a big effect upon how the slacker generation, the Generation X, started making movies, because they were very interested, stand-up comedians in the 80s were very interested in bringing a voice for the younger generations. A lot of, Janine Garofalo and Ben Stiller and Jon Stewart and all of these people who later ended up on MTV and would later end up to become super famous, all kind of started in the late 80s doing comedy. and this kind of stand-up comedy, it was different from the stand-up comedy that was happening before these kinds of generations. It was more, in the 70s, 60s, it was more political, and before that it was, kind of cheesy, sort of parlor tricky type of, take my wife please kind of comedy. Whereas these new comedians were kind of bringing this new sort of style of just, funny anecdotes about everyday life and about being of the generation that they live in. And I think that sort of sense of humor, those kind of ironic, looking at their own life from that perspective, had some influence into the writing and comedy in the slacker era 90s films. I think John Hughes would be the earliest film antecedent to the slacker era movies. I know Kevin Smith, who I think is, probably, along with Richard Linklater, one of the more obvious slacker era filmmakers. He admits that he is a huge John Hughes fan, and that John Hughes had a huge influence on his writing. Specifically, I have a few DVDs I'm going to show throughout this. The Breakfast Club. Now, The Breakfast Club would not necessarily count for exactly what I'm talking about, because it's a teen movie, it takes place in high school, it still deals with high school politics and high school agendas and cliques and popularity and these kinds of things that the slacker era movies weren't really concerned with. It deals with teenagers and principles and blah 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 blah. But the thing that this movie did do that would later influence these other films that I'm talking about is that it was an ensemble movie that was almost entirely dialogue. It's not a real contrived genre plot. It's about a bunch of kids in detention for 2 hours and the shenanigans that they get up to while they're there. I mean, that's the movie. That's it. And most of the humor is just purely from dialogue. There's no, slapsticky stuff. There's no, they're not trying to build a bomb or something, ridiculous like that. It's just kids talking and talking about their lives and talking about their perspectives and these themes of alienation and boredom and these kinds of things would later be staples in the slacker era movies. Comes through very nicely in The Breakfast Club, and I think this movie, along with other John Hughes movies like Pretty in Pink, which has a lot of environmental things that have, not environmental like trees or whatever, but environmental characters like the record store in Pretty in Pink is sort of a character in that movie, and the way he uses music, pop music of his day, even though it was 80s music, it was because of 80s new wave, whatever, but he sort of recognized that the youth can identify with this in a certain kind of way. So I think John Hughes is very, very important to the later 90s Generation X filmmaking movement. But alternative rock happened, and the fashion, the dress, these exact themes that I'm talking about, boredom, alienation, blah 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 blah. We all know about that. The whole grunge aesthetic, the whole Lollapalooza aesthetic. These are all had a huge influence on what popular filmmakers would do. They had to finally market to this audience that didn't exist before. Nobody really marketed to people in their 20s in the 80s, because people in their 20s were really the people who were paying to see movies. But in the 90s, that's a different story. Now all of a sudden there's Nirvana and there's the Smashing Pumpkins and these kinds of bands, and it changed the way people dressed, it changed the way people talked, and they had to start showing this demographic in film.